My wife secretly planned to take our kids and leave me for her co-worker. Now she's spreading lies about my control issues. My name is Nick, 36M, and until recently, I thought I was living a pretty average happy life with my wife, Sarah, 34F, and our 2 kids, Emma, 7F, and Jake, 5M. Sarah and I have been married for 10 years, and while things haven't always been perfect, I believed we were a team. We've had our ups and downs, like any marriage, but nothing ever prepared me for the betrayal I was about to uncover. It all started about 6 months ago. Sarah got a new job at a marketing firm and seemed thrilled about it. I was happy for her. She'd been wanting to return to work after staying home with the kids for a few years, and she finally landed a position that paid well and offered some flexibility. The excitement she had about it was infectious, and I was genuinely glad to see her so engaged. But almost immediately, things started to change. She began working long hours, coming home late, and often leaving the house early, saying she had early meetings. I didn't think much of it at first. I mean, it's a new job, right? I figured she was just adjusting. Then came the secrecy. Sarah was always on her phone, texting late into the night and smiling at messages she wouldn't let me see. When I asked her about it, she brushed it off, saying it was just work stuff and that I wouldn't understand. At first, I trusted her explanation, but then her behavior grew even more suspicious. She'd get up and leave the room whenever her phone rang, often heading outside or even locking herself in the bathroom. I couldn't help but feel like something was off. One night, she came home particularly late, and I decided to ask her directly about what was going on. She looked at me almost annoyed and told me she was just overwhelmed with work. But something in her tone didn't sit right with me. I let it go that night, but my suspicions only grew as the days went by. Sarah was drifting further away, and I felt helpless. I couldn't shake the feeling that she was hiding something big. A couple of weeks later, I started noticing subtle changes around the house. Small things like important documents missing from the filing cabinet, and her personal items like passports and birth certificates seemed to have been moved. At first, I thought it was just my imagination, but when I asked Sarah about it, she brushed me off, saying she'd been organizing our paperwork. Still, the thought gnawed at me. Why would she need those documents all of a sudden? It wasn't until I found an unfamiliar man's jacket in our closet that I knew something was terribly wrong. My heart pounded as I held it, realizing it didn't belong to me and had no reason to be in our home. I confronted Sarah about it, and she quickly claimed it belonged to a friend from work who had given it to her to hold on to. She said she'd been meaning to return it but had forgotten. Her explanation felt weak, forced, and I couldn't shake the gut feeling that she was lying. Over the next few days, I became increasingly paranoid. I started checking her phone whenever she left it unattended, but she'd changed her passcode. That was the last straw. My instincts were screaming that something was seriously wrong, and I decided to investigate further. One evening, while Sarah was in the shower, I slipped into her email account. There, buried in her sent messages, I found the proof I had been dreading: a series of emails to a man named Greg, her co-worker. The emails were flirtatious, filled with intimate details about their meetings and plans to spend time together without me knowing. I felt sick, my stomach churning as I read about how they'd spent lunch breaks together at a nearby motel and how they'd been planning to meet up during one of her supposed work trips. But that wasn't the worst part. My heart nearly stopped when I read an email detailing her plan to leave me and take the kids with her. She was planning to leave me, to uproot our entire lives, and take Emma and Jake with her to start a new life with this man. She described how they'd been saving money in a secret account and how she intended to file for divorce as soon as they'd saved enough to secure an apartment. They'd even discussed schools for the kids and how Greg would be the father figure they'd need. The betrayal was overwhelming. I'd never felt pain like that in my life. This wasn't just about her having an affair. She was planning on stealing my family from me, taking my kids away, and building a new life while leaving me with nothing. I could barely breathe as I processed what I'd read, and a sense of fury began to rise inside me. But what really tore me apart was seeing how she painted me in those emails. She called me controlling, saying that I was overbearing and that I wouldn't let her be independent. She accused me of being the reason she sought solace elsewhere, saying I pushed her into Greg's arms because I was impossible to live with. I was shocked. I'd always tried to support her, to be there for her, and now she was twisting everything to make it look like I was the problem, all while plotting to rip my family apart. I knew I couldn't confront her right away. If I did, she'd likely spin it against me and find a way to turn things around. I needed to gather more evidence to make sure that if this ever went to court, I'd have proof of her intentions. And so I began the painful process of documenting everything. I took screenshots of her emails, recorded conversations, and kept track of every suspicious move she made. It was torture to live under the same roof, pretending everything was fine while knowing what she was planning behind my back. In that moment, I made a silent vow to myself. I would fight for my kids, for my family, and for the truth. Sarah might think she could manipulate me, make me look like the villain, but she was in for a rude awakening. The woman I thought I knew had become a stranger, and it was time to prepare for the battle ahead. Living in the same house with Sarah while pretending I didn't know the truth was the hardest thing I'd ever done. Every time she looked at me, I felt a wave of disgust. I saw her lies in every smile, every hollow "I love you" before bed, and each time she hugged our kids, my heart broke a little more. But I knew I had to play along if I wanted to expose her and protect my family. I was willing to endure the torment for as long as it took. I became hyper-aware of everything she did, watching for any sign that she might be accelerating her plans. One night, when she said she was going out with some friends from work, I took the opportunity to search through her things. I wasn't proud of it, but I had to know the full extent of her betrayal. I found a small box under the bed, tucked away behind some old blankets. Inside, there were receipts for hotel stays, mostly during her so-called work trips, and a set of keys I didn't recognize. I also found a prepaid phone hidden beneath some old jewelry. It was obvious she'd been using it to keep her communication with Greg a secret. When she returned later that night, she looked surprised to find me still awake. I casually asked her how her evening had been, and she launched into some story about the girls she'd met up with, laughter in her voice as she spoke. I nodded along, pretending to believe every word, feeling my anger simmer just below the surface. Every lie she told only made me more determined. The next day, I took the prepaid phone and went through it. She hadn't set up a password, and it was filled with texts between her and Greg. As I scrolled through their conversations, I felt a twisted sense of relief, confirmation that my suspicions were justified, and that she really was planning to leave me. She'd even mentioned specific dates, discussing with him when they'd start looking for an apartment together. But then I found something that made my blood run cold. In one of the texts, she told Greg she'd been thinking of ways to make me look unfit as a father so she could get full custody. She mentioned how if Nick comes off as controlling or unstable, the courts will side with me. They laughed about how easy it would be, given that I had no idea what was going on. I could barely believe what I was reading. Not only was she betraying me, but she was plotting to paint me as a villain in my own children's lives, just so she could walk away clean. After I'd processed the shock, I realized that this was exactly what I needed to take her down. I began building a case, meticulously recording every interaction, every argument she initiated, every time she tried to provoke me. I knew I had to stay calm to avoid giving her any ammunition she could use against me. She thought I was blind, but I was already 3 steps ahead. Over the next few weeks, I gathered more evidence. I set up hidden cameras around the house, recording her phone conversations and late-night texts when she thought I wasn't watching. She talked to Greg about their plans, about how she couldn't wait to start a new life with him, free from what she described as the prison of our marriage. Each conversation I recorded felt like another stab in the heart, but I kept going, knowing that this would ultimately work in my favor. One evening, as I was watching one of the recordings, Sarah walked into the room and saw me staring at the screen. I quickly closed the laptop, but not fast enough for her not to notice the flash of panic in my eyes. She looked suspicious, but she didn't say anything. Instead, she gave me a cold smile and went upstairs to bed. I realized then that she might be onto me, that she might suspect I knew more than I let on. The thought made me anxious, but I couldn't let her see that. I had to keep my composure, no matter how difficult it was. A few days later, I noticed that she'd been spending even more time with our kids, taking them out for ice cream, planning little outings, and showering them with attention she'd never shown before. It dawned on me that she was trying to manipulate them, trying to turn them against me subtly so that they'd side with her when the time came. The realization infuriated me, but I kept my emotions in check. I knew this was exactly what she wanted, to push me to the point where I'd explode and give her exactly the evidence she needed to paint me as the bad guy. As I watched her laugh with Emma and Jake, I felt a surge of protectiveness for my kids. They had no idea what was happening, no clue that their mother was planning to rip their family apart and drag them into a messy custody battle. I decided then that I had to act sooner rather than later. I couldn't let her get away with manipulating them, with using them as pawns in her twisted game. But I knew that confronting her outright wasn't an option. She'd deny everything, and I'd end up looking like a paranoid husband with trust issues. No, I had to be smarter than that. Then, out of nowhere, I received a call from Sarah's mother. She sounded concerned, asking if everything was okay between us. Apparently, Sarah had been telling her family that I'd become controlling and emotionally abusive, claiming that I was suffocating her and not allowing her any independence. I could hardly believe what I was hearing. She was already planting seeds, setting the stage for her grand exit. I reassured her mother that things were fine, forcing a calmness I didn't feel, but inside, I was seething. After I hung up, I realized that I was running out of time. Sarah was laying the groundwork for her escape, making sure everyone around us believed her version of the story before she even left. I knew I had to accelerate my plan, to confront her with the evidence I'd gathered, and let her know that she wasn't as clever as she thought. But first, I needed one last piece of the puzzle, a way to ensure that she couldn't turn this around on me, no matter how hard she tried. That night, as I lay in bed next to her, pretending to be asleep, I felt a strange mix of dread and anticipation. I knew that the showdown was coming, that soon I'd confront her and force her to face the truth. But I also knew that it wouldn't end cleanly, that she would fight tooth and nail to escape the consequences of her actions. Still, I was ready. I'd been pushed to my limit, and I wasn't about to let her destroy my life and my relationship with my children without a fight. It was time to put an end to her lies once and for all. The next morning, I woke up before Sarah, determined to set my plan into motion. I'd spent half the night piecing together everything I'd gathered. The text messages, the recordings, the bank statements that showed her funneling money out of our joint account, likely in preparation for her new life with Greg. I'd even found evidence of her discussing custody plans with him, talking about how she'd prove I was unfit as a father. She had laid her plans out meticulously, assuming I'd never find out. But now I had everything I needed. I left for work as usual, but instead of heading straight to the office, I made a detour to meet with my attorney. He'd been briefed on the situation, but I hadn't shared the full extent of Sarah's betrayal until that morning. As I laid out the details, I could see his expression shift from professional concern to something closer to anger. He reassured me that with the evidence I had, we could take this to court and ensure she wouldn't get the upper hand. It gave me a small sense of relief, knowing I wasn't alone in this fight. After the meeting, I headed back home, knowing Sarah wouldn't be expecting me. I told her I had an important project to finish and would be home late, giving me a few hours to set everything in place. As I walked into the house, it felt eerily silent, as if it were holding its breath. I moved quickly, going through the evidence one last time, making sure I had everything in order. I'd installed a hidden camera in the living room the night before, hoping to capture her reaction when I finally confronted her. Just as I finished setting everything up, I heard the garage door open. Sarah was home earlier than usual. I felt a surge of adrenaline as I positioned myself in the living room, making sure my expression was calm and unreadable. She walked in, looking surprised to see me. "Nick, I thought you were working late today," she said, putting her bag down and giving me a cautious look. I replied, my voice steady. "But I needed to talk to you. I think it's time we cleared the air." She raised an eyebrow, trying to mask her nervousness. "What's this about?" I motioned for her to sit, and she did, crossing her arms defensively. I took a deep breath, my eyes fixed on her. "Sarah, I know about you and Greg. I know about the plans you've made to leave me, to take the kids, and to start a new life with him. I know you've been telling everyone I'm controlling and abusive, setting up your escape." Her face went pale, but she quickly regained her composure, putting on an expression of feigned disbelief. "What are you talking about? This is insane, Nick. You've really lost it." I held up my phone, playing a clip of one of her late-night conversations with Greg. Her voice filled the room, discussing how she could twist things in her favor, how she'd make it look like I was the bad guy. The color drained from her face as she realized I had proof, undeniable proof of everything she'd been plotting. She looked down, her hands clenching into fists, but she didn't say anything. "You've been lying to everyone," I continued, my voice barely above a whisper, "manipulating the people around us, trying to destroy my relationship with our kids, all for what? So you could run off with him. How long have you been planning this?" Sarah glared at me, her initial shock replaced by a cold fury. "You had no right to go through my things," she snapped, her voice dripping with contempt. "You're pathetic, Nick. You've always been pathetic. I was bored, okay? You're a boring, predictable husband, and I needed something more." I felt a surge of anger at her words, but I kept my cool. "You're the one who's pathetic, Sarah. You threw away our life, our family, for a man who clearly doesn't care about you. Did you really think I wouldn't find out? That I'd just roll over and let you take everything from me?" She laughed bitterly. "Oh, please. You're so focused on your own self-righteousness, you can't see the truth. You drove me to this. You made me feel trapped, like I was suffocating in this marriage. I did what I had to do to survive." I shook my head, disgusted by her twisted logic. "No, you did what you did because you're selfish. You didn't care about me, about our kids, about anything but yourself. You're willing to destroy everything just to get what you want." She scoffed, standing up and crossing her arms. "You think you can turn this around on me? Good luck, Nick. I've already set things in motion. People believe me. They see you as the controlling husband. No one's going to believe your little sob story." I took a step closer, my voice low and steady. "Maybe that was true before, but now I have enough evidence to show everyone the real Sarah, the one who lies and manipulates and uses people. You won't get away with this." She seemed to falter for a moment, a flicker of doubt crossing her face. But then she straightened, her eyes hardening. "You want to play dirty? Fine. But I won't go down without a fight. I'll make sure you lose everything." I watched as she stormed out of the room, slamming the door behind her. My hands were shaking, but I knew I'd taken the first step toward reclaiming my life. I didn't know what would come next, but I was ready. She thought she could destroy me, but I wasn't going down that easily. The day of the custody hearing arrived, and the weight of the last few months bore down on me like never before. The courtroom felt cold, sterile, like a battlefield where everything I loved was at stake. I took my seat beside my attorney, scanning the room. Sarah sat across from me with her lawyer, looking composed, calm. She had her armor on, her victim mask fully intact, ready to sell her story to the judge. I couldn't help but feel the knot in my stomach tighten as her lawyer began his opening statement, painting me as the controlling, unfit husband who had emotionally manipulated Sarah for years. He referenced her fear of me, her need for freedom from my suffocating presence, and how she had to shield the kids from my supposed outbursts. It was a well-rehearsed performance, with just the right amount of tears and quivering lips from Sarah as her attorney recounted her version of events. I clenched my jaw, gripping the edge of the table. Every word felt like a knife twisting deeper into my gut. She wasn't just lying, she was fabricating an entire narrative where I was the monster and she the innocent victim. It was everything I had feared, everything she had threatened. She was playing her part perfectly. My attorney stood to deliver my side of the story, laying out the evidence we had meticulously gathered. He presented the bank statements, the messages, the recordings, all showing Sarah's deceit. He didn't hold back, revealing her plan to take the kids and leave me for her co-worker, exposing her lies to friends and family. and the calculated manipulation she had orchestrated to turn everyone against me. As the evidence piled up, Sarah's facade began to crack. Her lawyer tried to object, to spin the narrative back in her favor, but the damage was already done. The judge raised an eyebrow more than once as the contradictions in her story came to light. My attorney was relentless, methodically tearing apart her lies piece by piece. He showed the recordings of Sarah's phone calls with Greg, where she openly discussed taking the kids and planning her escape without my knowledge. The courtroom was silent as the last piece of evidence, a damning text conversation between Sarah and Greg about getting rid of Nick and making sure the custody case goes in our favor, was displayed for everyone to see. Sarah's expression shifted from confident to panicked as the realization set in. Her web of lies was falling apart. I glanced at her, watching the fear creep into her eyes. For months, she had painted me as the villain, the one to be feared. But now the truth was out in the open. There was no going back. No more masks, no more lies. She couldn't hide behind her victimhood any longer. As the day wore on, I could feel the tide turning. My attorney had expertly shifted the narrative, and the judge seemed to be leaning in my favor. I was no longer the controlling husband Sarah had portrayed me as. I was a father fighting to protect his children from a manipulative partner who had lied, schemed, and deceived for her own gain. By the end of the day, the judge delivered his ruling. Sarah was granted visitation rights, but the bulk of custody was awarded to me. I had won. It wasn't a complete victory, but it was enough to ensure my kids would be safe from Sarah's toxic influence. As we left the courtroom, I felt a strange mix of relief and exhaustion. I had spent months fighting for this moment, battling lies, betrayal, and manipulation, and now it was finally over, or so I thought. A few days later, as I was settling into my new routine with the kids, I received an anonymous message. It was from someone who claimed to know more about Sarah and Greg's relationship, someone who said they had been watching me closely and wanted to help. At first, I ignored it, thinking it was just another attempt to mess with me. But then more messages came. They contained screenshots of conversations between Greg and another woman, someone he had been seeing behind Sarah's back. It was like I had fallen into a twisted soap opera. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. Sarah, who had so expertly played the victim, had been betrayed by Greg all along. He had been using her, stringing her along while continuing to see someone else in secret. The irony wasn't lost on me, but it didn't bring the satisfaction I thought it would. Instead, it made me realize just how deep the deception ran. Sarah wasn't just a liar. She was a pawn in Greg's game, just like I had been in hers. She had built her entire plan around a man who had no intention of following through, and now she was left with nothing. Part of me wanted to reach out to her, to show her the messages, to let her know that Greg had been playing her the entire time. But I couldn't bring myself to do it. She had chosen her path, and now she would have to live with the consequences. I had fought too hard to get out of her web, and I wasn't about to get tangled up in it again. The weeks that followed were surprisingly quiet. Sarah's attempts to smear me had largely failed, and while some of our mutual friends remained distant, most had come around, realizing they had been manipulated. The kids were adjusting to the new arrangement, and for the first time in months, I felt like I could breathe again. But I knew better than to think this was the end. People like Sarah didn't just give up. She might be down, she wasn't out, and I had no doubt she would try to find a way back into my life, into the kids' lives, any way she could. And so, as I sat on the porch one evening, watching the sunset, I couldn't help but feel a lingering sense of unease. I had won this battle, but the war wasn't over, not by a long shot. The scars of this ordeal would stay with me, a constant reminder of how easily trust can be shattered, how quickly love can turn into something dark and twisted. But I had survived. I had fought back and won, and I knew that whatever came next, I would be ready for it. Because in the end, it wasn't about winning or losing, it was about survival, and I had learned to survive.